Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Patria y vida, viva Cuba libre, no tenemos miedo. Homeland and life, long live free Cuba. We are not afraid. Those are just some of the chants that Cubans living within Cuba and the diaspora are yelling at protests. Please take a look at this video. What you just saw are the cries for a new Cuba, a free and democratic Cuba, a Cuba free from communism. Recall that Cuba has been a communist country for about 60 years. Life is very hard in Cuba, with rampant poverty, the poorest of any Latin American nation, and where the government controls nearly every faction of life. From electricity to the internet, the government is in charge. And by the government, I mean the one party which is allowed to exist, the Communist Party of Cuba, headed by dictator Raul Castro. So why are Cubans protesting for freedom now? Has the greed and corruption of officials reached a tipping point? What is the response from the diaspora in Canada? And just what will it take to restore democracy to Cuba? Well, joining me now is Michael Lima, founder of Democratic Space and the Canadian representative for the Council for Democratic Transition in Cuba. Thank you, Michael, for joining me. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Tanya.
So obviously, we've just seen some footage of protests in every corner in Cuba. Why are Cubans protesting?
Well, Cubans are protesting because they realize that the only way forward is to change the political system with free elections and to have freedom and democracy. Even though Cubans have numerous needs, they have scarcity of food, medication, even though professionals make very little because of the political system, and they are forced, you see doctors, engineers, to working in tourism. So there's a conjunction of frustration from all across sectors of society. Artists are tired of censorship, right on the Constitution, intellectuals, journalists, professionals. So they are aware that the only way forward in Cuba is to change the entire system, to get rid of the communist system through free democratic election and to move forward towards democracy. That's why, Tanya, you would see in the protests that people are chanting freedom and democracy, not just medicine or because they're living under scarcity. They realize that's the root of the system. Right. That's the root cause of all issues in Cuba.
So to help educate our viewers, because not all of us are up to date on the state of affairs in Cuba, and some of us may know very little. Could you give me a bit of a snapshot as to what life is like in Cuba and what happened when the communists took power and what has life been like since?
In Cuba right now, there is a group of people that might receive remittances from their families abroad. They might have better living conditions than the rest, but it's pretty difficult. People make average about $80, $85 per month, and the inflation is pretty high. So there is poverty, you have censorship, you have repression in Cuba. Say, for example, now with the reordering task of the Cuban regime, the so-called reordenamiento or reordering, most of the social programs that existed before have been eliminated. So people's access to public eateries, for example, old people or people with social needs, that's the prices for those places have gone higher. There is no way for you to have your own business. In Cuba, you have people that are self-employed. They cannot own their business. You have a political system that censors artists, that doesn't allow free expression. The cost of living is very high. For example, in comparison, like a kilogram of chicken or meat is more expensive in Cuba than, say, in Mexico City, Spain, or Miami.
My goodness. Okay, Michael, I'm going to pause you there. I want to go back a little bit more about some of the communist history in Cuba right when we return from this commercial break.
Okay, perfect.
Welcome back. We're discussing the democratic protests that have emerged in Cuba, and joining me is Michael Lima, the Canadian representative for the Council for Democratic Transition in Cuba. And you're a Canadian here, you're in Canadian soil. Michael, before the commercial break, you were discussing how life has deteriorated and have become so expensive with inflation and the cost of goods, as you mentioned, like meat being just astronomical. But life wasn't always like this in Cuba. There was a time before communism where life was good. Am I right?
Yes. Well, we had during the Republic, prior to 1959, we had two Republican periods. The most democratic era was from 1940 to 1952. Then came Fulgencio Batista, which was a military general that gave a coup d'etat in 1952. And yet, from 1952 to 1959, Cuba was an authoritarian country, but there was a private economy. Cuba was the social indicators in Cuba were higher in terms of beds, hospital beds per inhabitant than in many countries in Latin America. Educationally as well, the Cuba literacy rate was the rank fourth in Latin America in the late 1950s. So the standard of living was very different from what it became after 1959. There were social issues in certain pockets within the countryside, but the Republic was prospering, except for this authoritarian period in which, of course, a general came, gave a coup d'etat, and interrupted the constitutional era that had lasted from the time Cuba had its constitution in 1940 up to 1952. So quality of life deteriorated significantly. Mm-hmm. The civil society that existed in Cuba, there were unions, the students had a university autonomy prior to 1959. Of course, we had this conflict with the dictatorship during the Batista period, but the way things turned after 1959 cannot be compared to before, because the idea of the revolution was precisely to return to the constitutional era, to hold free elections, to respect the 1940 Constitution, and yet the revolution turned once again into a dictatorship and into a totalitarian state.
And now you have a one-party system, which since the 60s has been ruled, correct me if I'm wrong, by Fidel Castro, who's now deceased, and now his brother Raul.
Exactly. And the curious thing is that communism in 1959 was very unpopular. The Socialist Party of Cuba during the Republic was very unpopular among university students because they made deals with authoritarian rulers during the Republican period, with Gerardo Machado in the early 1930s. And then the Socialist Party, most of the members integrated with the first Batista government. Batista was a military who staged a coup d'etat, as I mentioned, in 1952, but before he ruled constitutionally, and most of those communists integrated into the Batista government. So communists were pretty unpopular. They were a minority. Most revolutionaries in the late 1950s just wanted a change of system towards a democratic system, not towards a communist and much less a totalitarian regime. So communism was an anomaly in Cuba in 1959. But
then forces saw a window of opportunity and seized the opportunity, I think.
Absolutely, yes. Fidel Castro understood that even though in 1959 he might have had a majority at that point, but he was unable to rule democratically in 1959 because ruling through a democracy would have meant an opposition, recognition of a rule of law system, accountability as a government. So he preferred to have the totalitarian system instead of a democratic system. There were other external forces, but he preferred that system because it allowed him to remain in power. That was his agenda all along.
And the United States responded in the 60s and 70s, and for the most part cut off a lot of relationship with Cuba. Nobody's allowed to travel there. There was a freezing, if you will, of discussions because of the way Cuba had devolved into this communist state. Was that helpful or hurtful? We have 45 seconds before commercial.
Well, I think it was the context of the Cold War. At the time, Fidel Castro preferred to have the Soviet system installed because it suited his own political agenda rather than having a democratic system in Cuba. I think the main issue was that the revolution did not allow any form of freedom, any form of elections within the, say, 62 for 1959. There should have been elections, but there were none in Cuba.
Okay, we're going to continue this discussion when we return from this commercial break. Welcome back. We're discussing Cuba and the recent uprising and democratic protest, and not just in Cuba, but those protests are happening around the world. And joining me is Michael Lima, who's here on Canadian soil. He is the representative for the Council for Democratic Transition in Cuba. Michael, before commercial, we were discussing how, I guess, communism came to be in Cuba and how that society has devolved, how people now, there was a loss of freedoms almost overnight. And this went on for decades, and society devolved, and people were thrown into extreme poverty, and still are to this day. Why are these protests happening now? Why not 10 years ago? Why not 20 years ago? Were there always protests, or it seems like this has become a real lightning rod moment?
I think that's an important question, Tanya, because for decades, the system that came into being in 1959 discouraged any form of protest. There was some protests in the early 1960s. University students led peaceful protests to return to the 1940 Constitution, so that the revolution ideas were implemented in the early 60s, free elections. All of those things were betrayed by Castro. There were some early revolts, but those things were crushed. Those revolts, or those protests were crushed. So for decades, we had an educational system that punished any form of criticism in Cuba.
And can you explain what kind of punishment you're talking? When you say the protests were crushed, and if you were punished if you criticized Cuba, how were people crushed?
Well, for example, in the early 1960s, the first protests against the revolution were people that were also revolutionaries, but they considered that the revolution came into being for holding free elections, for returning university autonomy. So you have university students protesting for those things, for holding free elections. You have people protesting because the revolution turned into a communist path,
right?
And they considered that a betrayal. So those people were, at that time, they were thrown into jail. Some were shot, some were forced into exile. So once the revolution consolidated its power within the first 2 years, what you have is an indoctrination through the educational system in which a punishment meant that you could not go into university if you criticize the regime, that you could be thrown out of work if you criticize something. So you had either that you could be thrown into jail, or that you could be expelled from work, or expelled from a school. So different forms of repression, or you could be subjected to a character assassination by the regime on television, or acts of repudiation, numerous repressive techniques that the regime has used for the past 60 decades. So what you have in the last 2 years is a reemergence of the culture of rebellion among young people. There's a new generation of artists. It all started with artists in Cuba, the San Isidro movement artists. San Isidro is an artist movement that was founded in 2018. They were protesting against censorship laws that prevented artists from exhibiting privately in their homes or from conducting their work in private. So they created a movement that included journalists, activists from all across sectors of society. And through their actions, they included many people that are now in the protest. So I see a reemergence of the culture of rebellion. Also, there were, since the 80s, the human rights movement started in Cuba, a peaceful movement for rights. They've also led the road for the events that we see now. Groups like the Patriotic Union of Cuba in Eastern Cuba, they've contributed to fostering that culture of rebellion that is reemerging now.
Now, what you're explaining to us here, be it the life conditions or even this history of attempted rebellion against this communism, this is very foreign to many Canadians. Of course, many Canadians come from communist countries and have escaped that. But for many Canadians, they've reduced seeing Cuba to a vacation space, and they don't see what happens outside of the resort. What are your concerns, or do you have any concerns with Canadians vacationing in Cuba? What are your thoughts on that in the minute we have before commercial?
Absolutely. I think Canada, as a country that has kept close relations with Cuba, the government of Canada is in a unique position to raise a voice, condemn repression, hold the Cuban dictatorship accountable for his crimes, and implement numerous actions so that the regime respects human rights. And I think Canadians going to Cuba should realize that they're not Cuba is the longest lasting dictatorship in Latin American history. So they should realize that when they go into Cuba, they should join Cuban Canadians in pressuring the Canadian government to hold the Cuban regime accountable for their actions. Right now, we can talk in another segment, but repression is pretty intense in Cuba. So lots of things Canada can do, absolutely.
Okay, well, we're going to pick this up right when we return. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on democracy in Cuba and the recent protests and cries for democracy from Cubans both in Cuba and the diaspora. And joining me is Michael Lima, representative for the Canadian representative for the Council for Democratic Transition in Cuba. Michael, before the commercial break, I was mentioning how Canadians really vacation quite a bit in Cuba. Now we have some Americans going since that was sort of opened a few years ago under the Obama presidency. Many travelers, I hear stories. I've never been. I choose not to vacation in communist countries. For me, that's a particular issue. But many travelers go, and I know that some of them want to help, and they bring goods that simply can't be brought into Cuba. They bring goods and money for the staff at the hotel resorts. Is this helpful?
I think the best way to help the Cuban people is to help them to live in a free and democratic nation. You can give humanitarian aid that will help people survive, but Cubans are pretty capable by themselves to have a democratic and free nation. So for Canadians, goodwill Canadians, I would urge them to help now, to help with the people that are on the streets since July 11, asking for freedom and democracy, to call on the Canadian government to impose targeted sanctions against heads of the regime, to pressure the regime to submit to the will of the Cuban people. I think you can bring bars of soup in Cuba, you can bring food, medicine, but the best way is to help the Cuban people to live in a free and democratic nation. So people in Cuba, lots of professionals, lots of people with capacity to have a better living condition, a better life for themselves. So that's what I would suggest.
And I know there have been reports suggesting that, and maybe you could speak to this, that many of these resorts actually just funnel money right to the government. So is it, should Canadians be vacationing in Cuba at all?
I think morally that's a moral issue, because in Cuba, Gaesa, which is a military holding company, controls over 50% of the Cuban economy. Most hotels in Cuba are owned by the military conglomerate Gaesa. They control hotels, they control ports, they control import companies, retail stores, rental car companies. So basically the entire Cuban economy. And we're talking about the same army that uses its repressive apparatus to repress dissidents, artists, to surround the homes of independent journalists, force them into house arrest, torture human rights activists, export Cuba's repression to Venezuela, through advisors and torture methods that they have exported to Venezuela. That's documented by human rights organizations. So morally, I would encourage Canadians to, the priority is to help Cuban people to be free, not to go into a vacation into the longest lasting dictatorship in Latin American history. That's my suggestion.
Okay, so practically speaking, have you been pleased with the Canadian government response in dealings with Cuba in the last few years, especially the last month?
No, I think the silence of the Canadian government has been deafening in the past years. Canada had numerous opportunities, and I refer to the Justin Trudeau government. For example, in September of 2018, at the United Nations Human Rights Council, there was a proposal by UN Watch to hold the Cuban dictatorship accountable on eight measures for respecting human rights, to release prisoners to release people arbitrarily detained, release political prisoners, to force the Cuban regime to respect internationally recognized freedoms. 8 measures, and Canada voted against those measures. And I refer to the Justin Trudeau government that voted against those measures. 2018, also, the Canadian government recommended the Cuban regime to release political prisoners, to legalize NGOs. And ever since, repression has gotten worse. So I think Canada could raise a voice in any democratic struggle. It's essential that democratic nations like Canada, speak up publicly to condemn it and to take actions to help civilians in Cuba.
Okay, very well said. Thank you so much for joining me, Michael. And we'll have to come back and touch base as the situation hopefully evolves in Cuba. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
We're very blessed to live in a democratic country like Canada, and in such, we need to help support others in their fight for democracy around the world. Cuba may very well be one such place, and we have to keep our eye on this issue as it evolves in the coming months. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.